Now, Penn State lost to Notre Dame in the semifinals 27-24, and that game showed me that their entire playoff run was a complete fluke because out of all of the teams that made it to the semifinals, Penn State had the easiest path to that game. You know, they only had to play SMU and Boise State, two of the weaker teams that were in the playoffs this year, and they were double-digit favorites in both of those games, and they were always overrated to me because I was looking at Penn State and I was asking, you know, who have they beaten? They lost to Ohio State. They lost to Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. The only two good teams they played all season. Drew Aller didn't look that good in either of those games, and he didn't look good against USC. You have to come back from behind and win that game in overtime. You know, Penn State, I felt like them losing to Notre Dame was destined to happen. You know, it was a little bit of a shocker to some, the way the outcome of that game transpired, but it really wasn't to me because Notre Dame, they're a battle-tested team. They are a team that not only are they well coached, but they have an outstanding defense. And this game was the perfect example of why you can't judge a team based off history. You see, the premise with Notre Dame this year in the playoffs, why they were counted out is that, well, they always come up short. Well, you can't judge Notre Dame from what they've done in years prior when they were in the playoffs because this is a way different team than what they were those years. You see, with Penn State, their lack of elite playmakers on the perimeter hurt them in this game. Did you know that none of Penn State's receivers caught a single pass in that game? That shocked me. When you think of how well James Franklin recruits, you wouldn't think that his receivers would be so bad that they would get strapped up by Notre Dame. But Notre Dame, turns out, they have one of the best secondaries in college football. You see, when you're going up against SMU and Boise State, it's easy to have your stock inflated. Okay, because SMU and Boise State, from a roster standpoint, they don't come nowhere close to Penn State. But Notre Dame did. You see, Notre Dame in the second half, they won by staying true to who they are. They just find ways to win because they're good in all three phases of the game. Decent on offense with a really good rushing attack. They got a great defense with the secondary that has a lot of speed, size, and athleticism, and they're really good in special teams. They got a good field goal kicker. They can get hidden yardage when it comes to the return game, punt returns, kickoffs. Remember in that second half against Georgia, they ran it back the first play of the second half. You know, it just felt like Penn State was too good to be true. And, you know, James Franklin now falls to 1-18 all time against top 5 teams. And I had a homie that took Penn State to win this game outright. And I felt bad for him because I was like, my brother, you learned the hard way about betting on little games James Franklin. I was never sold on Penn State when they got into the playoffs. I just looked at their path and I said, you know, they're either going to lose to Georgia or Notre Dame because there's no chance in hell James Franklin is going to be able to put together a well-coached enough game to be able to take down a coach like Kirby Smart or Marcus Freeman. And although this game was close, you know, look how Notre Dame was able to win. In the before halftime, you got to put your backup in because your starter gets banged up. You have an injured offensive tackle. You got guys dropping left and right. Abdul Carter just destroying everybody, and yet they still find the way to eke out a victory. You know, Notre Dame all season long, they have found ways to win games, and they've come through in the biggest moments. For Penn State, on the other hand, you know, against Ohio State and Oregon, if you can't beat those teams, how are you going to expect to compete with Notre Dame? A lot of you all are going to be really shocked with how close this Notre Dame-Ohio State national championship is going to be. Notre Dame isn't going to get blown out. They're too well-coached of a team for that to happen. But when Penn State played Ohio State, though, it seemed like they couldn't even buy offense. And the game was a lot more one-sided than what the final score showed. They got a little bit lucky early on during that game with getting that pick six early on Will Howard. You know, just with Penn State moving forward, Yeah, they probably are going to be a frequent participant in the expanded playoffs, but they're going to be one of those teams that we talk about them now the same way that we talk about Notre Dame. We're going to be judging them based off history. Every time we see Penn State in the playoffs, we're going to be like, yeah, like they're probably going to get no further than the second round, because if the seeding made a little bit more sense, and let's say that Penn State had to take the same road that Clemson had or Arizona State had, they wouldn't have beaten Texas. I don't even think they would have beaten Georgia. And why do I say that? Because look at James Franklin's track record. He's 1-18 against top 5 teams. History shows us that James Franklin is good to let you down when you go up against a competent opponent. It's one thing to go up against a SMU team that still had a roster that was on the G5 level mostly. And they only got in based off a technicality that they made it to their conference championship game because they were in the weak conference. Yeah, they're a well-coached team, but they also benefited of all of the chaos from the SEC with Alabama and Ole Miss losing. If Bama and Ole Miss never lose, SMU isn't in the playoffs. And the same probably could be said for Indiana. And Boise State, they didn't even really deserve a first-round bye, because I don't think a first-round bye should be awarded to a team that doesn't play in the P4 conference. Because the only reason Boise State's argument was for getting a high seed was because they kept it close and lost by 3 to Oregon. So with the easy path that Penn State had the first 2 rounds, I never was really sold on this team. And you can harp on if Indiana, SMU really deserve to be in, but you got to have that same conversation about Penn State, because I never once looked at Penn State and felt like they had an opportunity to win it all. You can say they're one of the best 12 teams, but are they really what they have beaten Clemson? I felt like Clemson could have beat them. Would they have beaten Georgia? Would they have beaten Oregon if they played again? I really don't know, because let's say Penn State doesn't have that late interception by Drew Aller, and they're able to drive down the field. And let's say they get a touchdown, they win it, right? We're talking about a rematch between Penn State and Ohio State. How do you think that game goes? I think Ohio State drags them. I really do. Because Ohio State is playing better now since that loss to Michigan than what they were the first time they squared off. I felt like it probably would have been like 42-17 with the way that Drew Aller plays in big games. Not only does James Franklin come up small in these big-time matchups, but so does Drew Aller. For some reason, James Franklin just can't seem to get the quarterback position right. He can't seem to get it right on offense. It's like the 3rd straight year in a row that Penn State has been limited with their options at wide receiver. You got great running backs. You always have a fantastic defense. But for some reason, anytime James Franklin gets into these big-time matchups, he just gets small. He just does. And that's why I never really bought the hype with Penn State being able to win it all. And I'm glad that Notre Dame sent them packing, man, because this playoff run for me was a fluke. Oregon should have got the easy path that Penn State did, because Penn State losing the Big Ten championship only benefited them. They were a beneficiary of a flawed playoff seeding system. If these teams were seeded a lot better and accordingly, and, winning your conference championship didn't mean that you would have to play Ohio State off a bye. Penn State, I don't even think they make it out of the first or even the second round. I could have seen Indiana beating Penn State. Who's to say that maybe if Alabama gets in, maybe they could have beaten Penn State. I still would have took Penn State to win that game, but I'm just saying, like, I got some questions about just how good this Penn State team just truly is, because how good are they? Honestly, I'm asking a serious question right now. They lost to the 2 best teams they played this season, and then you lose to Notre Dame in the semifinals. So you were 0-3 against all of the elite teams that you played this year. So what does that show about you?